Does it count if it's an accident? Written by Strawberry Time. Read by Arashi. The Black Eagles' Monday morning class had begun as it typically did. It started with waiting outside of their classroom door for their professor, who had gone up to Manuela's room to fetch her key and lesson plan for the Blue Lions, a Monday habit that had started after a particularly nasty weekend for the former songstress that had left her sick and hungover until late in the afternoon. While Edelgard respected the kindness their professor showed, after 2 months of starting classes late, though the Blue Lions were no different, she felt it was about time to ask her teacher for a spare key so they could at least get settled a lot sooner. Her classmates were all gathered in the surrounding courtyard to wait. Linhardt was sleeping against one of the pillars that Caspar was attempting to climb. Dorothea and Petra were off to the side having a discussion about the native birds found in Brigid, after Petra had found an owl feather earlier. Bernadetta had hidden herself somewhere, and Ferdinand had tasked himself with finding her. She and Hubert remained standing by the doors, watching the others, when one of the monastery clerics came rushing up to the classrooms, keyring in hand. Edelgard had to hold back her sigh of resignation. Their first hour was going to be free study. She could feel her headache forming as Caspar cheered. She turned to Hubert, who was standing to her right, arms crossed at his chest and a hand held up to his chin, to gauge his response to the news, knowing he'd have some sort of comment, but found that his attention was locked on something out in the yard. Intrigued, she followed the direction of his stare, and found Ferdinand with his back turned to them, hands on his knees, bent at the waist, over by the bushes, most likely trying to coax Bernadetta out from behind them. Not an unusual sight, as most of the Black Eagles, herself included, have taken it upon themselves the task of getting Bernadetta to be more comfortable around them, and accustomed to conversing with her classmates. Looking back at Hubert, and then back at Ferdinand, she had to wonder why he found it was worth the attention. It wasn't news that the two bickered and argued often. It was now more worrisome if they didn't, but Ferdinand was quiet at the moment. He wasn't loudly proclaiming any superiority in his skills, talking about his family, challenging her to some duel or other silly contest. He was simply, gently and softly working on calming down their resident shut-in. So to see Hubert hold such an intense stare at the other noble's direction was puzzling. He wasn't glaring, and his look wasn't that of anger or annoyance. It was more intrigued. Interested? No, that wasn't quite right either. She doesn't think she's ever seen Hubert look at anything like this before. His eyes seemed darker, and had tilted his head slightly, as if to see better, and one of his fingers had begun stroking his chin as if he were contemplating something. But with the class finally unlocked, it was time to focus on more important things. She nudged Hubert to get his attention, and called out to the rest before making her way inside, nodding in thanks to the cleric who had hastily lit the sconces and fireplace. Linhardt had settled at the desk near the fireplace. He had pulled out a pillow from somewhere, and was in the process of fluffing it as Caspar tried in vain to convince him to keep his eyes open. Dorothea and Petra settled at a desk together, their conversation continuing on. Edelgard herself walked up to the chalkboard at the front and began writing out a review of last week's lessons. Bernadetta had settled in the back corner of the room, and every time Edelgard looked up from her notes, she could see the other girl slowly inching closer to the door to escape. It was as she wrote out one of the calculations that it started. Ferdinand had, quite literally, jumped to his feet and pointed at the board, exclaiming that she had miscalculated and that her notes were wrong, by a decimal. When Hubert had scoffed at the ridiculous and nitpicky accusation, Ferdinand had whirled around to face him, claiming the life and death values of exact calculations, thus starting the day's argument. Edelgard pinched the bridge of her nose. They hadn't even been in the classroom for 5 minutes. She continued to finish writing out the review, looking back at the two nobles, watching as the argument grew more and more. Hubert sat at his desk, arms crossed, and he leaned closer to the other, looked as if he were greatly considering strangling the other man at that moment. Ferdinand, though not as intense, looked like he shared that sentiment as he braced both his hands on the table, as he leant into Hubert's space, his mouth forming an angry pout whenever he wasn't talking. As their argument went on and their voices grew louder, so much so that Dorothea and Petra's conversation had paused as they listened in on the embarrassingly familiar display, and Edelgard could see Bernadetta inching her way further and further from the corner of the room so she could try and run out of the room. Caspar, though, was focused now on trying to physically remove the pillow out from under a sleeping Linhardt. It was when Hubert suddenly slammed his hands down on either side of Ferdinand's, as if to push himself to stand, that Edelgard felt it time to finally step in. Why she hadn't yet said something she was wondering herself. Though their disputes never came to physical blows, mostly due to the professor's interfering, she feared that's exactly what would happen any moment now, as she made her way closer, when there was suddenly a loud shout as Caspar tumbled to the side, knocking into Ferdinand with Linhart's pillow in hand. The noble was pushed forward, his gloved hands finding no purchase on the polished wood he was leaning on, directly into Hubert, who had just begun to open his mouth to form some rebuttal, only to have it completely covered with Ferdinand's own. Edelgard could only stare with wide eyes, faintly registering Dorothea's gasp as the classroom abruptly fell silent. Even Caspar, sprawled on the floor, was speechless as they watched and waited. There were no words. Even Linhart had lifted his head enough to see how this would play out. What Edelgard expected to happen was for Ferdinand to quickly back away, apologies spilling from his mouth, and quick hand movements to show his panic. She had expected Hubert to push the other man away, to watch him loom over both him and Caspar, to hear a harsh whispered threat before stalking out of the room to collect himself. What she doesn't expect is for Ferdinand to slowly raise one of his hands, as if to cup Hubert's jaw, only for it to freeze and hang in the air just shy of reaching the other. She doesn't expect the oh-so-soft sound of lips moving against each other. She definitely does not expect to watch as Hubert's visible eye flutters briefly, as his head tilts just ever so slightly before Ferdinand eventually pulls away. Though Hubert's face was impassive, she could see the same burning intensity as before in his eyes, as he stared at the noble before him. Ferdinand continued to hover over Hubert before abruptly standing, and Edelgard could see the exact moment the embarrassment hits him, sees that his face has completely blushed red from his hair to his neck, and his eyes are wide as they dart around, trying desperately to avoid the shocked stares of his classmates and the piercing gaze of the other man he just accidentally locked lips with. It was then that their professor walks in, boots hurriedly clacking on the stone. They calmly walk through the door with a gentle hand on Bernadetta's back as they steer her back into the oppressive, awkward silence that permeated the room. It didn't seem as if they noticed, or cared about, what exactly they walked in on. They just closed the doors, walked to the front of the class, thanked Edelgard for writing out last week's tactics, before telling everyone to take their seats so they could finally begin. The hours dragged on, and the shock of what everyone had witnessed had yet to pass. Edelgard occasionally would take a look at her friend, trying to find any change in his behavior, but his face remained blank, his body tense. The only outward sign that something was strongly on his mind was that he wasn't writing any notes. The grip he had on his quill threatened to snap it. "Now, for this week's chores," their professor trailed off as they surveyed the students present. "Ferdinand and Hubert, you two will be working in the stables." Edelgard glanced at Hubert and watched for a reaction. She could feel the others bracing for Ferdinand's outcry of protest. But nothing came. Instead, she watched a small secretive smile grow on her friend's lips before it was just as quickly smothered, catching just the faintest blush high on his cheeks. Turning slightly, she eyed Ferdinand over her shoulder and saw his always present smile had grown just a little wider. His blush returned slightly, and his leg had started bouncing in apparent excitement. His eyes constantly flicked between the professor and the man sitting beside her. She smiled to herself as she refocused on today's lesson, because whether Hubert wanted to or not, they were definitely going to talk about everything that happens later.